But let's start with Joe Burrow. Obviously, it's week 2, right? You're coming off the week 1 game against the Cleveland Browns, and it kind of feels like, all right, this is where the Cincinnati Bengals offense kind of locks in and really begins to do good things offensively, moves the football well, and you kind of start to see Joe Burrow, that MVP type of guy in Joe Burrow. And I think a lot of people had a lot of optimism that we would see that in week 2. I certainly did as well. 3 and out to begin the game, and then a really nice drive offensively. You go down and score a touchdown, and then obviously disaster strikes. And Reed kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier on off the bench, basically saying anytime you see Joe Burrow get hit, anytime you see that pocket collapse, anytime you see him go down, you kind of just collectively hold your breath, right? As a fan base, I think everybody does that. Reed was kind of alluding to the fact that he feels like he didn't have to do that as much. He had finally gotten over it, right? Burrow was healthy, obviously, throughout the entirety of last year. Did have the kind of scare that last game against Pittsburgh, but he ended up being just fine. That kind of neck crunch, right? In that last game of the season, he ends up being okay. And Reed said he kind of had gotten over that. I think me personally, anytime you see number 9, in duress where he's getting hit hard or he's getting wrapped up low, you kind of just hold your breath. And, right, that certainly was the case this game against Jacksonville. And the play prior to him getting hurt was a sack, right? And that one looked a lot, honestly, worse than the play where he actually hurt his toe. And then, you see him slow to get up, and then he gets up, and then he can't put any pressure on it. He takes the helmet off, he lays back, and kind of it just, your stomach drops, right, when you see that happen with Joe Burrow. And, look, we're going to talk about national storylines on my show, as I've talked about, but obviously we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Cincinnati Bengals. And here, as we grow the show, I don't have a problem admitting, right, that I am a Cincinnati Bengals fan, right? That's just kind of the reality of the situation. And I'll be honest with you, currently 24 years of age. When I was a kid growing up, I probably was a little bit too attached to the Cincinnati Bengals as far as, my personality kind of really depended on if they won or lost games. If they lost, I would kind of hold on to it for probably a little bit too long. Certainly on Sunday, if they lost, I was kind of in shambles throughout the rest of the day, right? And as I've gotten older and matured, I've finally been able to move past that a little bit. Do I get ticked off or frustrated when they don't play up to the standard that I believe they should play at? Sure, but at the end of the day, we're fans, right? Life goes on. It's just football. But there's one thing that can happen that can really just absolutely depress you as a Bengals fan, and unfortunately, we saw that yesterday. The Bengals could have lost yesterday 70-0. And they could have went up against Minnesota and, again, lost 70-0. And we would have been ticked off. We would have been frustrated. We would have been embarrassed. We would have been mad. We would have been complaining. We would have been in shambles. But at the end of the day, everything would go on just fine, and we would continue with the season. And then Joe Burrow gets hurt, right? That's just, as a Bengals fan, that absolutely kills you. It makes you depressed. It makes you sad. It makes you frustrated. And just the fact that you don't get to watch Joe Burrow play for a couple of months at minimum, right? The Bengals had their frustrations over the past couple of years, didn't win as many games as they should, but kind of my takeaway was we get to see number 9 go out there and play quarterback. This is a true once-in-a-lifetime type of talent. The Tom Brady's of the world, the Peyton Mannings of the world. Yeah, there's one of those guys, and he's here in Cincinnati, and his name is Joe Burrow. And regardless of the success or lack thereof that this team has, you get to watch him go out there and play. And when that gets taken away as a fan, obviously that is incredibly depressing, and that's kind of where we're all at right now. I can't even imagine, obviously, being Joe himself, how he feels, right? He probably feels like, he puts all this work in. He does everything he can to be at the top of his game. He finally has a off season where it kind of goes perfectly, right? He's healthy. He plays in the preseason. He gets through that. And then here in week 2, he basically immediately gets hurt here in this 2025 season. And obviously, that is something that is very, very difficult to stomach for the Cincinnati Bengals. That's really worst case scenario, right? You could lose 5 games in a row, but if he's still out there, it's like, it is what it is. You lose number 9, and ultimately everything kind of falls apart from there, right? Are you a Super Bowl contender without Joe Burrow? No. All right, but luckily for the Cincinnati Bengals, you're in a spot where maybe you can still stay afloat for long enough with Jake Browning at the helm to perhaps put you in a situation where you can get to the postseason. And, the report this morning, there's, reports, obviously, as you kind of look at the time frame of this. He goes down, and then you're kind of holding your breath like, oh, my goodness, is this an Achilles, right? That's kind of worst-case scenario there, is if it's an Achilles, and obviously he's out for the rest of the year, and then that's going to certainly affect his offseason there as well. It's not an Achilles, so you kind of hold your breath there, and then you're like, well, is it an ankle? Is it a foot? Could this be something that's a 4 to 6 week injury? And if you go back and watch the replay, he points directly to his toe. when he goes down and the training staff kind of comes out. And then, you're breaking down the potential situations that could happen with a toe injury, right? Is it, a dislocated toe, something where you can, pop back in and be good to come back? Something where it's a broken toe where you might have to miss a game or two, but perhaps a situation where you could work through it and play through it? Or is it, in fact, turf toe, right? And it's funny because you hear the injury turf toe, and you're like, oh, that can't be that bad, right? Turf toe, that kind of sounds like a rug burn, right? That can't be that bad. Well, the reality of the situation is turf toe is awful, and it's a grade 3 turf toe. So, a grade 1 turf toe, you're in a situation where you probably can play through it. It's going to be painful, but you can probably manage it, especially as an NFL caliber athlete. Then you kind of got the grade 2 range, right? Kind of what Brock Purdy's dealing with, where it's like, yeah, you don't need surgery, but it's going to cost you some time. You can't put weight on it. You're using the crutches. It's going to take you 4 to 6 weeks, what have you. Or you're in a situation where it's a grade 3 turf toe and you're going to need surgery. And obviously, we found out this morning that is, in fact, what Joe Burrow has. And it was interesting because I actually was talking with some buddies the night prior on Saturday night about turf toe, and we were having kind of that same conversation because we were, talking about the Brock Purdy injury, and we're like, why is it called turf toe? Like, that's just the silliest thing in the world, that just some serious toe injury is just called turf toe. And then, of course, it happens to Joe Burrow the very next day. But grade 3 is the situation there. So kind of there's the ebbs and flows of, you're checking your phone for the update. Oh, my goodness, what is it? Okay, it's a toe. How long is he going to be out? And we still don't have full clarity on that as of right now. Zach Taylor will take the podium in a matter of hours. He's going to shed some more light onto that. Also, Shamar Stewart is hurt. He's probably week to week, it feels like. He'll have an update on that later today as well, so make sure you check our social media pages for updates on that. And also, Cincinnati's going to bring in a veteran, right? Reed alluded to this on Off the Bench. They're not going to bring in some guy that's going to start, right? But Jake Browning needs a backup, and I think there's going to be a plan in place where they bring somebody in that isn't just Brett Ripien being elevated from the practice squad. But you're kind of in a spot right now where you don't know exactly how long this is going to take. 3 months has been the time frame that has been floated out as it relates to Joe Burrow and this toe injury. Could he come back before that? Possibility. Could he come back after that? Or not come back at all? Certainly a possibility there as well, and it's going to be a kind of wait-and-see thing. I would be shocked if Zach Taylor put a target date on it when he addresses the media today at his press conference. It's probably going to be a situation where, Joe's going to need surgery. He's going to get the surgery as quickly as possible, and we'll go from there with Jake Browning as the quarterback. Anything beyond that answer from Zach Taylor probably would surprise me, but he'll take the podium later today, and obviously we will find out. So the question becomes, can this team stay afloat before Joe Burrow possibly gets back? And I want to be very clear. This team still has a chance. If Joe Burrow can return, this team still has a chance, and 2025 isn't completely dead. Now, yesterday, it's tough. We had a night to sleep on it. You feel a little bit better now, right, even after understanding that he's going to need the surgery. But I think yesterday it kind of felt like it was over. It was ruined. The season was done. It was cooked. No more Joe Burrow for the rest of the year. Apparently, there's still a possibility that he could come back. So we're going to spend some time in a little bit breaking down Jake Browning and breaking down the schedule throughout the rest of the season over the next 3 months before Joe Burrow, in theory, could return. Again, Ian Rappaport, Adam Schefter, some local people throwing around that 3-month time frame. We will see. But the biggest question now when people are talking about Joe Burrow is, one, the injury-prone comment, right, which is frustrating for all of us, myself included, and also the comment of, has the organization failed Joe Burrow? That's something that when you flip on the TV nationally and people are talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, make no mistake, if national people are talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, they're talking about Joe Burrow and his injury history and kind of if the organization has failed him. That's what the narrative is going to be nationally over the course of certainly this week, the next couple of months, and into the offseason as well. And that certainly is something that is very frustrating for those of us that kind of take in content from the national media. When they're talking about Cincinnati, it's all going to be negative. They're going to be banging on, the organization and the coaching staff for putting him in a spot where he's behind all these bad offensive lines, and certainly the fact that, he is injury prone, right? And unfortunately, the answer to those two questions right now are yes. And the questions are, is Joe Burrow injury prone, and has the organization failed Joe Burrow? And the reality of the situation is, yes, they have absolutely failed Joe Burrow. Adam Schefter tweeted this out earlier today. Burrow's rookie season, obviously, was in 2020. And, there's different metrics and stats you could use to evaluate offensive line performance. But pass block win rate is probably the best one to use when you can consider protecting a quarterback, right? Avoiding a quarterback from, stepping into harm's way, right? Pass block win rate is probably the metric to look at. Not, blocking for, run blocking, right? That doesn't, do much. When the quarterback is dropping back to pass, how are you doing as far as your pass protection? In 2020, when Joe Burrow was a rookie, 29th in the National Football League. 2021, when Joe Burrow led the team to a Super Bowl after the serious knee injury in which he suffered, 30th. 2022, when the Bengals went back to the AFC Championship game, 30th. Let me be very clear. There are 32 teams in the NFL, and the Bengals went 29, 30, 30 in his first 3 years. 2023, 27th. All right. Of course, he got hurt that year with the wrist. 2024, 32nd. All right. Again, there's 32 teams in the NFL. Last year, they were 32nd, and we viewed, myself included, as the 2024 offensive line, the best offensive line that Joe Burrow had, and they were last in the National Football League in pass block win rate. And this year, through 2 games, they're 28th. Right. Now, that's just a failure by the organization. Now, I want to be clear. It's not something that they haven't tried to address. The Bengals very clearly have tried to address the offensive line. They bring in Frank Pollock a couple of years ago. He's supposed to be some guy that knows how to coach the offensive line. That clearly did not work. Zach Taylor understood that, said, Frank, sorry, we got to go our separate ways. We got to fire you. We got to bring in a new guy, Scott Peters. This is his first year here in Cincinnati. First couple of weeks hasn't been much better than what Frank Pollock had to offer. Draft picks. They've allocated top-of-the-line resources to their offensive line. Obviously, Amarius Mims is a number 1 pick, right, in the first round. Dylan Fairchild this past year, he's a 3rd-round pick, right? Even Cordell Volson as a 4th-round pick, dedicated a draft, pick to him. OBJ, he had a lot of success in Baltimore and Kansas City. You brought him in, paid him a lot of money in free agency, something as an organization you don't do, particularly along the offensive line. You brought in OBJ to be your bookend left tackle. He's been good in spots, but he's also been hurt in spots, and he also has been bad in spots. And the first 2 games this year, Orlando Brown Jr., granted he was dealing with Myles Garrett in week 1, but he was flat out bad, right? You've addressed it in free agency over the course of a couple of years, right? Ted Karras, he's worked out at center. That's been really nice, right? But bringing in Alex Kappa at center, right? That clearly didn't work out. You tried to run that for a couple of years. He was one of the worst offensive linemen when it came to pass block win rate. He ends up leaving for Las Vegas, right? And then you bring in Lucas Patrick, who I think that's probably the most frustrating one, right? Because you didn't address it early in free agency. You did it at the very end, and you were basically like, oh, yeah, he's going to be our left guard. Yeah, he's going to start for us and protect Joe Burrow, and we kind of just signed him at the end of free agency when he's a guy that's been a journeyman throughout his career to the NFL to this point and hasn't ever really been looked at as a viable starter, but we're going to look at him as a viable starter. But the point being, you've tried, right? You've brought in new personnel. You've changed the coaching a little bit as well, and it clearly has not been better, and unfortunately for the Cincinnati Bengals, that is an indictment upon them as an organization that they cannot figure out the offensive line. Now, is there a direct line towards their performance and Joe Burrow's injury-prone nature? I don't know, but I think it's a safe bet. You have to say it, right? Because he's been hurt so many different times, and I think you have to look at the protection as the number 1 reason why. Play style certainly impacts it as well. Joe Burrow holds the football. We know that. And really, if you didn't think that was obvious, well, did you watch the second half with Jake Browning? Clearly different in terms of holding on to the football than Joe Burrow. But that's what makes him great. That's his style of play. He's always done that. And where does Joe Burrow rank among NFL quarterbacks if he totally changes his game and doesn't do that? Is he even a top-of-the-line quarterback if he doesn't have that element to his game? I don't know. We'll see if he has to pivot how he plays after yet another serious injury here for Joe Burrow. And then that second question. So clearly the organization has failed him. That's just kind of the reality of the situation. Now, people will take it over the top and they'll say, oh, he's the next Andrew Luck. He's got a couple of more years left before he calls it quits. That's not going to happen. I would be shocked, right? But the narrative that the Bengals didn't at least try to protect him, that's incorrect. They tried, but they failed because they haven't been able to get that offensive line figured out throughout the entirety of his career. Again, coupled a little bit with his playing style, holding on to the football, trying to extend plays, and just the playing style that Cincinnati has, where so often they're in obvious passing situations where even if they're, in a close game, the defense knows they're not running the ball. They're throwing it with number 9 because they've got all the weaponry that we have. So based on the playing style of the team, the just overall philosophy of the football team, and Joe Burrow, how he plays, and obviously with the offensive line and the troubles that they have had, that has created these injuries for Joe Burrow. And the second part, the first part was, has the organization failed him? The answer to that question is yes. The second part is he injury prone? People, that phrase injury prone, I mean, that kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit. It frustrates me, right? Because it's nothing Joe can do about it, right? It's just kind of, he's gotten hurt. These aren't situations where it's like, oh, he, jammed his finger, he's going to miss a ton of games. No, these are serious injuries that he has suffered that hasn't allowed him to go out there and play football games. Again, if he's in a spot where, he rolls his ankle, oh, he misses a game or two. Okay, fine, right? Or, he sprained his knee, he's only out for a couple of games. No, seemingly when Joe Burrow gets hurt, he's not in a position where he misses a couple of games. It really ends his season. Now, there's also other injuries that haven't been documented that he has that he plays through, so maybe he's just constantly hurt, and there's a lot of stuff he can play through, and that's why, really if he's missing games, he's missing large chunks of the season as opposed to just a game or two. But when we break this down, he's been in the NFL. This is year 6 for Joe Burrow, and this is just kind of where we're at. Remember, he had that injury at Ohio State, too, where he broke his hand, and that really caused him to lose that quarterback battle with Dwayne Haskins. If that doesn't happen, probably doesn't end up going to LSU, and then who knows, what Joe Burrow is if he doesn't go to LSU. Probably, certainly not the quarterback here in Cincinnati, but there's one injury, right, with the hand at Ohio State, and then his rookie year, the knee. And something about these injuries, too, is they're unprecedented. These 3 that we'll really talk about in detail here, he didn't just tear his ACL. Right, he tore his ACL, his MCL, his PCL, and his meniscus all in the same play. His knee was ruined on that play against the Washington Commanders, or the Washington football team, maybe in his rookie year. Just completely ruined, right? You've seen quarterbacks tear their ACL or tear their meniscus, but all in one, pretty serious injury. In 2021, obviously, it was the Super Bowl year. If you remember, he dislocated his pinky that season. He was able to play through it, so that certainly was good. And then he sprained his knee in the Super Bowl, but was able to play through that as well. But, just more bumps and bruises for Joe Burrow. Throughout that season. And then in 2023, obviously had the calf strain that happened right at the beginning of training camp, caused him to miss camp. They kind of probably rushed it a little bit, right? When he came back and played week 1 against Cleveland, couldn't move around at all, and it was a really, really slow start for Cincinnati that year. And then later, he eventually was able to get back to, typical Joe Burrow performance without missing games to that point, mind you. And then obviously had the wrist injury on Thursday Night Football in Baltimore, and that was, NFL quarterbacks, there was no history of that injury happening, right? It was just a very fluky thing for an NFL quarterback to have to endure. And similar here with this toe injury, right? We talked about it a little bit on Off the Bench. Yeah, people get turf toes all the time, but usually it's a grade 1 or a 2, not a grade 3. Mahomes had one a couple of years ago that he was able to play through and was able to push the surgery off until after the season. But a turf toe situation for a quarterback where he has to, miss up to 3 months, obviously that is something that is pretty unprecedented, and that's something that Joe Burrow will have to deal with, obviously now as we progress. So, 2 situations there. The Bengals clearly have failed him, right, to this point. And I'm someone that sticks up for the Bengals organization more than lots of other people. Clearly they have failed him, right? Is there a direct correlation between his injuries and the lack of protection? I don't know, but, the reality is he's missed a ton of games because he's been hurt, and he gets sacked all the time, and he gets hit all the time. I would think that those 2 things kind of travel in the same direction as one another and align with one another and, heavily correlate between the 2 as well.